Imagine that one of the things that distinguishes a human being from a computational device, say, or at least the standard sort of computational device, is that our primary cognitive problem is how to perceive the world so that we can act in it, so that we can get what we need to have or want. Okay, so all three of those things are roughly of equivalent importance, right? You have to be able to perceive, and you have to be able to act, because if you can't act, then you can't get what you need, and if you can't get what you need, then of course there isn't any you. And so we're trying to always solve those problems simultaneously, and we're also trying to do it in a way that's sustainable. Now, what that means in part is that the knowledge structures of human beings are organized or they're organized along those three dimensions, and those three dimensions also constitute the problem space in some sense that has to be addressed for a solution to be useful. So not only do you have to be able to perceive in some accurate manner, but the accuracy is determined in part in terms of whether or not the way that you're perceiving helps you pursue something that you want to pursue, and then the utility of wanting to pursue something is dependent to some degree on the relationship between the utility of that and the things that you need to continue to survive. Now, some psychologists have addressed that by thinking about such things as fundamental drives, you know, and that was mostly a behavioral idea in some ways, and a drive might be hunger. And the idea of a drive would be that hunger is a motivator that helps you put together strings of motor behaviors that are sort of run out in automatic sequence so that you can get the end that you want and continue on perhaps to fulfill another drive. But the idea of drive is a little bit on the oversimplified side, although it has its place. I think that you can conceptualize the relationship between all of these by thinking in the following manner. So imagine, first of all, that people are after something, generally speaking. Now, if you look at us, you can kind of tell that we're the sorts of creatures that are after things. And the way that you can tell that is, first of all, that we can move and do so frequently. So we're always on a voyage of some sort, or a journey of some sort, from point 1 to point 2, or from point A to point B. I would say as well that that's also the hallmark of a simple story. If you're telling someone a story, generally what you do is you tell them about a time that you were somewhere, and then you did some things and you went somewhere else. It's a very, very simple story. Now, the advantage of thinking about it as a story is that it helps you understand that the entire cognitive structure can't be reduced to necessarily anything that's, for example, that's drive-like. You have to think about it as more personality-like. And so you want something, you orient yourself towards it. Now, the way you do that, generally speaking, is with your sensory and your conceptual systems, right? So, for example, if you want to walk towards the door, then you turn your head and you make yourself a model of the door, and that model has to be bounded by its relevance to your actions. So, you know, the things that are going to be relevant to you about the door, for example, might be whether or not it's tall enough for you to walk through, or whether or not the door is open or closed, so that you can, as you're walking towards it, you can organize your body so that you can interact with the object as you see fit. Now, you pick your goals for all sorts of different reasons, and some of those reasons are more fundamental than others. So, for example, fundamental. By fundamental, I would mean, likely what I mean by fundamental is something like evolutionarily ancient. You know, so the older the necessity, or the older the system that's evolved to allow you to pursue the necessity, the more fundamental it is. And there's ways of identifying what constitutes the fundamental elements of goal-seeking behavior, and you can do that in part by comparing yourself to other animals. You know, and so mammals, for example, all seem to experience something that you might regard as anger, or at least defensive aggression. They're all hungry. You know, they all have they all act as if they highly value sexual behavior and so forth. And so those, you can't really think of those things as specifically human. They're lower level than that. Now, so at a fundamental level, you have biological systems that are setting forth what might constitute a goal, and you can think about that. You can think that what the system is doing is setting the goal, or you can think that the system is driving behavior. But a better way of thinking about it is that the fundamental motivational system sets up framework that's like a personality that then acts in the world. And so this personality has something in mind that it wants. It has a collection of perceptions that organize itself around that thing that it wants. And then it has a plan or associated motor behaviors that it can lay out in the world that will take it from the point where it is to the point that it wants to be. Okay, now, so once you know that, then you can start to think about these plans or these goals or these stories or these frameworks. I think those are all, you can even think about them as games in some ways. You can think about them at different levels of complexity. Now, what Piaget was trying to do in part was to describe how a framework of this sort, or a sub-element of personality, might develop itself in complexity over time. So the diagram I have here before you shows these little oval-like figures, and in the bottom left-hand corner there's a box that says what is, and in the top right-hand corner there's a box that says what should be, and then there's some arrows showing a planned sequence of behavior. And the idea is that you have a sense of where you are, and you have a sense of where you're going, and that constitutes the framework within which you're looking at the world. And then within that framework, there's different things that you can do with your body in order to advance from the first point to the second point. Now, it's important to understand that this sort of thing is grounded in behavior and not in conception, because it helps you also understand the nature of these fundamental elements of personality. The fundamental elements of personality are not descriptions of the world. They're tools for acting in the world, including the associated behaviors. Now, whether they're behavioral or conceptual, to some degree, depends on their level of abstraction. So here's how to think about that. So imagine that you say that someone's a good person. And you might say, well, that's a description of them. And when you think about description, you tend to think about description the way that you would describe an object in the world, like a scientific description. But when you talk about someone as a good person, you're actually not describing them as an object in the world. You wouldn't even describe yourself as an object in the world that way. What you're doing is using a shorthand to represent the hierarchical arrangement of their personality. And you can get away with it because when you say good person to someone, they already have an understanding of good person and they know what that hierarchy is, and so you don't have to explain the whole thing to them. And you can understand each other without even necessarily knowing exactly the details of what you're talking about. But I'm going to tell you now what I think you mean when you say that sort of thing. So imagine that a good person is a description at the top end of a hierarchy. Okay, because the good is a very high level philosophical abstraction. It's a high level value. Be good. Okay, so what does that mean if you decompose it? Well, we'll do it in a relatively straightforward manner, one that isn't really, it's more observational than philosophical. So let's say you take someone who's a 40-year-old mother, for the sake of argument, and who will say she also has a job. So if she's a good person and she's a mother, you might think that one sub-element of her personality, if she's a good person, is being a good parent. Right? And I think you'd put person above parent in the hierarchy. Because to be a good person, you can be a good parent without being a good person, but it's hard to see how you could be a good person without being a good parent. So, and maybe if you're a good person, you're more than a good parent, you know, you're probably a good partner, and maybe you're good at your job, and like there are large domains of activity that you're good at or good in. And if you sum your behavior across that or average your behavior across that or something like that, then you end up reasonably being described as a good person. Maybe you're a good friend as well. And so good person has levels of hierarchy underneath it. And then each of those things that have levels of hierarchy, each of those entities at the level of hierarchy right underneath good person can also be decomposed. So we're going to decompose them and we're going to see what happens. Because partly what happens is if you decompose them, you get right to the bottom. It's not an infinite decomposition. And so I also think this is one way that you can think about the relationship between the mind and the body. Because the relationship between the mind and the body is a very tricky thing. Because the mind seems to be made of stuff that's other than the body. And I think there's some truth to that, partly because we don't really understand consciousness. But that's a complex problem. And I think you can get a fair ways in addressing the mind-body problem without having to drag in the problem of consciousness. So, okay, so we could say, well, good person, sub-element of that is good parent. And then you might think, well, what is it that you need to be doing to be a good parent? And we might say, well, you have to have a good job. Maybe that's one up in the hierarchy, but whatever. You have to have a good job because otherwise you can't provide for your children. And you have to be able to care for the children. You might say, well, someone's good at caring for children. And then you might ask them, well, what does it mean to be good at caring for children? And then you have to sort of think of the sub-elements that would go into caring for children. And so one of them here is you have to know how to cook a meal or complete a meal. And then you also have to know how to play with the baby. So we could concentrate on playing with the baby. And so what do you do when you're playing with the baby? You might play peekaboo, you might tickle the baby, and you might clean the baby. Okay, now you start thinking, well, obviously once you're starting to get down to that level of detail, so that's a high resolution model, right? You're starting to move from a low resolution model, good person, to a high resolution model, which are what are precisely the multitude of elements that make up being a good person. Well, if you're playing peekaboo with a baby, for example, all of a sudden you're doing something that's not exactly conceptual. Being a good person is conceptual, but playing peekaboo isn't conceptual, and the reason it's not conceptual is because you actually have to move your hands to do it. So if you get to a high enough level of resolution in the description of a personality, what you start describing are patterns of behavior. Now they have associated, they have an associated motivational framework and a viewpoint that goes along with them, so that I would say, well, even while you're playing peekaboo with the baby, the element of you that's playing peekaboo is best described as a sub-personality. It's a playful sub-personality, and then it's the sub-personality that specifically knows how and is motivated to play peekaboo. But what it's composed of is no longer a sub-personality. It's starting to be composed of actual movements. So, and then underneath that, if you go to higher resolution, like, okay, what's the movement composed of? Well, obviously you start to have to talk about musculature, and then if you go below that, it's molecular movements and so on. But once you're down below voluntary movement, there's really no you there anymore, right? You sort of fade into unconsciousness, because you know how to go like this, but you don't exactly know how to move the specific muscles that enable you to go like that. Or even if you do, you don't know how to twitch the muscle fibers or something like that, right? There's some, you don't know how to operate the cells. There's some level of resolution underneath voluntary motor control that basically runs on automatic, and to some degree you're capable of like steering it, but you're not really capable of, you're certainly not capable of being conscious of it.